In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use the paint material brush inside of the terrain editor. Alright, so let's go ahead and open up our terrain in the terrain editor just by double clicking on it or going to edit object with the procedural terrain selected. And what we want to do is go ahead and select our paint material brush, and in here we have this default rock material that has been applied. Now we could go ahead and use this, but this is just going to be laid down as a base material. So I want to create a new material. I want to create some vegetation on top of this. So let's come right down here to our materials and load in a new material layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and use this natural 3. I like the dry grass that it gives, and then also a little bit of a rock that's going to show up in some of these sloping areas. So we'll hit OK on that, and you'll see that that applies itself to the materials in our layers here. Now what we can do is begin to paint right on our terrain wherever we like. Now let's go ahead and try to paint with this natural 3, so make sure it's selected, and start to paint across these bluffs here. Now you'll notice that nothing is actually painting, and that's because invert is turned on. So you want to turn that off, and then you can begin to paint in those areas. Now we can adjust our fall off and our flow if we want to. So if we take our fall off all the way up, we're going to get a very hard edge here. And again, if we take it down, that's going to adjust it to be a softer brush. Alright, so let's go ahead and just paint in this vegetation across the tops of our mountains. And I'm just going to continue to paint along even to these edges here. And let's just get this rough area with that vegetation. Okay, you can zoom out, you can work on this a little bit further back, might be a little bit easier. And if you want, you could also use your paintbrush. Okay, now, or I'm sorry, your pen tablet. And again, that's affected by turning on or toggling these buttons here on the right side. So if you want to toggle or adjust your pen pressure of the size, you just activate the size pen pressure toggle. Okay, now I'm okay with using the mouse for right now, so should be okay. Almost finished here. Let's continue to work on this. Alright, so now that we have this painted up with most of our vegetation area, the rest of this is going to be our path, and then we're going to create kind of a rocky material on the inside here. Now let's say that we've got a little bit too much vegetation in one area and we want to get rid of that. Now I can invert this selection, and that will begin to erase that current layer. Right? So let's start to create the path here. Now before we do that, let's hit OK on this and preview it in our scene. Just make sure that this is the right material that we're looking for, because it's really hard to tell inside of that terrain editor because it gives you just a base color. Let's do a quick preview of this just to see how this is looking. And it looks a little yellow, and that's because of the atmosphere that we're in. It's kind of a sunset, and it's not going to be as conducive to for this particular material here. So we might even change that atmosphere to just kind of change up those colors. Alright, so let me just switch this up really quickly. Let's right click on our atmosphere. Let's choose something like, we could do like Great Ocean Road, something like that. Do a preview on that, and that gives us a little bit of a different color on that. This is a little bit easier to see. Alright, so now let's start to paint on the rest of this. We'll double click on this. Now just like we did before, we can actually use that environment clipping to constrain to just the road itself. So if I want to only paint on that road and not necessarily on my cliff edge, I could do so. And let me take this down so that way I'm not painting on the vegetation areas. This is going to be a little trickier, but this should be okay. Alright, so let's choose a different material. Let's load one in, and let's try something that's a little more rocky. Could do like this rocks and plants here. I'll hit OK on that. I'm going to take my brush size down just to kind of avoid painting too much on some of these different areas. And we'll come in here and we'll start to paint those areas. Let's go ahead and make that a little fuzzier for our environment. So let's take the fuzzy top, set that to 2, and then also the fuzzy bottom to 2 as well. And let's go to 1. There we go. Now let's continue to paint. That way it kind of blends in with the other materials as well and doesn't get too out of control there. So now I can just paint in these areas, and I can do this fairly quickly, but if I take my size up, okay, creating just some sort of variation in here. And let me just go across the entire elevation here. This one getting a little jagged here. Let's take that fuzziness up a little bit more on the top there. That should be okay. Now let's hit OK on this. Let's render that out just to kind of see what that looks like. And we've got some areas that aren't showing up all that well, and that's basically because of the slope on that. So if I kind of come over here to the top and I do a quick render, you can see that some of this should be painted with that color there, but it's not. And again, that's because of that slope influence that we have on some of these materials. So let's grab our terrain editor again. Let's turn off that altitude constraint, and again you can see some of these areas. We can grab our natural 3 and just come in and start to paint on that, and you can go over the top of some of these materials here. Kind of adjust that. And let's actually take that rocks and plants and let's invert that and erase that from this. Let's kind of smooth out some of these edges here. Get that to blend just a little bit better. That's a pretty abrupt color change as well. From that green to that black color, but that should be okay. If we erase along these edges, we might get that to blend a little bit better. What I really want to take care of is just this pixelation that was created from our mask. And I think I changed my mind on the rest of this, so let's go ahead and just erase that as well. And there we go, we've got that color there. And now let's start to paint along the front of these bluffs here. So let's choose a different material. And I'm going to go with something kind of a gray color. Might even choose like this gray mountain or even the gray mountain rocks. And let's invert this, or turn off invert. Let's take our size Let's paint on this. Now this is going to paint over the top of everything, so let's try to use that environment clipping again. It should save the settings that we had before, so let's just kind of adjust those. Let's take our amount down. And we should be pretty good right here. And I'll just go ahead and start to paint that in. I'm going to adjust the fuzziness of the top here so that way those colors blend a little bit better. And again, we're going to get a little bit of that pixelation in there, and that's nothing that we can't handle just by erasing that. Okay, along those edges. Let's go ahead and go to the fuzzy bottom. Let's paint that in there. Alright, so now let's go ahead and hit OK. Let's take a look at our material inside of our view. Now, looks like I got a little lost there. There we go. And let's hit quick render. And we've got that bluff there. We've got a little bit of a variation with those colors. Okay, so we've kind of got that plant, rock vegetation. So we've got that in there. We can go ahead and do an overlay on that vegetation. We can start to put in patches of dirt on different slopes and things like that. And I believe that's a mixed material as well, so you could even adjust that material, but that's beyond the scope of this. We just wanted to talk about how we can begin to paint and control painting inside of our terrain editor. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to get into creating effects on our terrain. So I'll see you then.